you all for being here this morning. I think it's only right that NCTE starts off with a session that focuses on Indigenous knowledge and on Indigenous education, and as importantly, that we acknowledge the land that Baltimore is upon now. I just want to thank the presenters first off. I mean, the pictures said so much, and then the stories that accompanied with them were even more powerful. So thank you for sharing your knowledges. Thank you for sharing the work and the work of your students. I'll just kind of go through by each presenter. I might jump around because the order that was listed was a little bit different. But Melissa was first, and I'm not sure if it was in your slide, but it was last night. There was a lot of shifting, which happens in the last minutes. But you had a quote that says, "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are." We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And I think that that's so important as we consider the pedagogies that we employ in our classrooms and that students come with into our classrooms as already having. And instead of helping students to see things our way, we need to provide spaces for students to see things their way and for us to be listeners and learners with them in that fashion. And it was just so cool with all these presentations. I'm from Montana. I grew up in Polson, Montana on the Flathead Indian Reservation. I'm non-native, I'm Filipino-American, but during my time there was welcomed and invited into their culture, customs, and traditions. But I just remember it took me, growing up in the middle of that reservation, it took me till my junior year in college at the University of Montana to read a book that reflected Indigenous peoples and that reflected on the spaces and places that I grew up. And I remember this intense feeling while reading that book that I didn't have to visualize what the authors were attempting to help me visualize. I saw it. I've been to those places. I've walked those lands. And to have that, it just gives me goosebumps right now just to think about it. To have that backdrop, to have that context, how much more motivated and engaged I was when I was reading a book about myself, about the people that I grew up with. And I think that lesson carries forward in the work that we're all doing, that we need to create these spaces for students to see reflections of themselves, but also to question those reflections and to question the way that we engage in our world. So I do want to say that who we are matters, and with all the presenters, they explained who they are. How they're in relation to the land, or how they're visitors to the land. And I think that that's so crucial and so important, not just for this presentation, but for all teachers who come into spaces. That we need to share and reflect and be in process with students about our identities in relation to the spaces and places that we are in. And so one question that came up, Melissa, for me is how do we sustain ourselves in what have been historically unsustainable places? And it's not easy to do. I mean, even in this space in NCTE, I was just talking with Joaquin about this was the first year that I've seen a number of different presentations that are focusing on Indigenous education. And there is a Native caucus, but I think it's been dormant for a little bit, so we should talk about that. But if you think about the framing of the conference, if you think about the names within the conference, if you think about English language arts, and the question that you asked, I think it was Augie, can English language arts be indigenized? Right? Because we're operating on a premise that it is the English language that we're operating through, right? And so can it be indigenized? And I think we also should think about what the when we move indigenous, which is a noun, to indigenizing, which is a verb, what can be lost in that translation? What are the complications that occur in such a shift? And what do we need to be careful of when we make that shift in the work that we do? And then I just want to push a little bit, Melissa, and with all the presenters, that you're creating spaces within classrooms that help these students to process and understand their feelings and emotion based on a backdrop of settler colonialism, which is erased in our curriculum, it's erased in our classrooms. And so for you who are at the front lines of teaching these students these truths and these lessons, how do you move past the reflection into the action? How do you help students see that they are transformative, that they have power to engage in actions that change their lives, that change their realities, and to create classroom spaces that practice those discussions, those conversations that they might have in spaces outside of the classroom. So thank you so much for your presentation. The question of just thinking about what must happen for us not to see each other as human came up. And it was sort of a reverse of your question. But I think it's an important question for all of us, that particularly when we're in this time where we operate within different truth levels or within different realities, what has been ingrained in us and taught to us by our families, by our communities, that allow us to look at a human being and not see them as human. And also to create spaces within classrooms to navigate those feelings, to navigate those understandings, and to process what it means and the transformative power of seeing each other as human. You didn't have it within your slides today, but yesterday you had something in there that was a culturally sustaining or culturally relevant pedagogy scorecard, which is a scorecard of how relevant or how much culture is included into a curriculum. And oftentimes when we talk about culturally relevant or culturally sustaining or culturally responsive pedagogies, it becomes sort of this to-do list or this checklist. And I want to hazard against that if we are operating upon a checklist that's created outside of the communities that we're from and operating outside of the students that are with us, there is potential to have some damage there. So I would just caution us when we have these to-do books or these scorecards to really reflect on how it's impacting our students and to listen to our students' interests. And then the last thing that I'll say, Joaquin, is critical books, and for all of you, critical books are a great start, right? It helps people reflect and see where they're coming from or how their paradigms are different than others. But how do we push that criticality within the classrooms? The book is a great start, but what is the pedagogy? What are the questions that we're asking and that the students are asking of one another when they're coming into contact with ideas or knowledges that are outside of their own paradigms? And so I would push us to think about creating sacred truth spaces. I know safe spaces in schools is sort of a popular thing right now. But if we shift it to think about sacred truth spaces, what are the truths that students come in with? What are their realities? And how do those come into contact with other people's realities? And I think in that type of situation, safety isn't centered, because when we think about safety, it's usually white student safety that is centered within that. And so we need to consider how those conversations can come into contact with one another, but still having it be a loving space where we can have disagreement and where our identities and ideas can change through that. With Avi, I'm just reminded of, there's this program called the KEEP program. It was a research project done, I think it was in the 80s. And they brought what was really productive and generative in this Hawaiian context for Native Hawaiians. And they said, all right, we're just gonna transplant all those ideas and put it on the Navajo reservation. And it's gonna work just as well, right? And that's what I was kind of hazarding against with that scorecard, is that when we take these ideas, process them, and think that we have found the answer and put it into a different area or working with a different community, it can crumble. And that's exactly what it did, because they were operating off of different indigenous paradigms. Even though they were indigenous to the lands and places, it wasn't indigenous from Hawaiian to Navajo. And so thinking, how does our work translate when we move into different spaces, when we're working with different people? Oh, and also, thank you for bringing song into this space. I thought that was just so beautiful, and if I had a voice that nice, I'd be singing. We're not all blessed with that, but thank you. I think that different ways of sharing that work and really bringing the work that you do with your students into this space is just so beautiful. And then I'm still lingering on from homeless to houseless. There's just so much power within that shift. And I do want to talk about this allies, and then your critical HALI pedagogy. I think it's so crucial and so important that we, when we come into a new area, we see how we are related to that area, or how we are invited into it. And when you came, I would be interested in understanding how you developed that trust with the students, how you positioned yourself, how you reflected on your positions, and how your students eventually, because it sounds like it, how your students eventually accepted you into their community. And part of that, that critical HALI pedagogy was, you mentioned the importance of dialogic learning and listening to learning. And I think sometimes we position ourselves as teachers as holding knowledge and passing that knowledge to other students. And what you're saying is an important paradigm shift, in that you're listening from students, understanding where they're coming from, and using the knowledges within the classroom space. So it makes me think of a question: how can students provide the curriculum for the classroom, right? Yeah. And then for Nick, I was thinking about my res dog growing up. My sister actually just visited me, and she was telling me a story of how our dog, my mother got a visit from a rancher nearby, and he came to our house and said, "Could you stop having your dog round up my cattle?" And that, I mean, that's just thinking about that as a metaphor. Like, from those on the outside who see res dogs, they see like this unfortunate circumstance of this dog that doesn't have a home, that isn't loved, that isn't cared for, and that's just not the case. It's the res dogs that I've come into contact with are so loved, so cared for, and so nurtured. And I think it's a good parallel to when Indigenous students come into classroom spaces, particularly classroom spaces and or schooling systems that attempt to dehumanize them, that attempt to say that they're less than or unworthy, without interrogating the curriculum and pedagogy that's used within that space. And so I thank you for bringing in res dogs as a legitimate source of knowledge. And that's just a fantastic example of the ways that we can learn from students, and the ways in which you brought your identity into the classroom as well. So just overall, I wanted to think about a few things. Can ELA be indigenized? What must shift within that term, within the language that we use, in order for that to occur? How is knowledge positioned in ELA courses? How can we disrupt unidirectional learning, as in learning from the teacher to students, and make it more dialogic, where learning occurs between the relationship building that occurs between teachers and students and community? And what must educators reflect upon and understand to engage in work that is humanizing, that allows us to see each other as humans? And I also want to consider us to think about how thick the walls are between our schools and our community. And I don't mean the structure, but I mean, are the students' communities, families, home-based knowledges included in schooling spaces? And in what ways are schooling structures part of the community? And if it's difficult to answer that question, then I think we need a fundamental shift of how we view ELA courses and what they can bring into schools, and vice versa. And then the last thing I would charge all of you is to think about the ways we can bring in those home-based knowledges. How can we develop lessons, assignments that allow students to make sense of their realities, but also to develop materials for future courses where their stories come into contact with stories of others. So thank you so much.
We have time for about one or two questions for the panelists. Go ahead.
I teach in Alaska in a school with like 99% microdecibel. And I found myself often in a kind of a strange position where Alaska, as a state, has tried very hard to make sure their teachers are educated about the cultures they go into. but the kids themselves have lost touch with their culture to the point where sometimes I find myself knowing more about it than they do, and I'll try to like work that into a lesson, and it just doesn't work at all because the kids didn't know that was a thing, and then suddenly I find myself knee deep in a situation where in order for what I said to make sense, I have to teach them their own culture, and that's not, like, that doesn't feel like a respectful place to be either, but I don't know what to do about it. So, I guess for the parents, how would you handle that?
Well, I mean, I have the same issue in a sense. But from my perspective, it was actually one of the Hawaiian teachers, Hawaiian studies teachers that came to me one time, you know, a friend, and was hanging out, and he said, you know, how do I get these kids to care about their culture? And I said, well, first of all, it's not that they don't care about their culture. What is their culture? I mean, and what I find is that, sure, I know that I've done a lot more research on the culture of my Hawaiian students, for example, than they have, but I don't have more indigenous knowledge than they have, and I have to always be cognizant of that. So you just have to understand that it's more of the approach, and as you come to it. So that's why I said there's a difference between culture education and then culturally responsive. I mean, they overlap with one another, and so it's how do you find the pathways? Because what I find is that they will, if it's, especially if it's more like you're trying to impart to them the indigenous knowledge, I would say that they would probably be resistant to it in my context, right? But when you're learning it like alongside with them, it changes the dynamic. And I wish I could think of my sleep deprivation as preventing me from a concrete example. But there are just certain things that are localized. Are you from the community?
No.
Oh, okay. So I'm not either from my community. And so a lot of times it's more about asking them questions and your curiosity about their worldview and that sort of thing. And then you say, well, you know, and then you make those kind of comparative. So it's dialogical in these both ways. And so like I tell stories all the time. They love hearing stories about where I'm from and those kind of things.
Because of the apocalypse that your students' ancestors survived, their traditional culture may not be intact, but they have culture, and it might be skateboarding or heavy metal music or something like that. That's maybe the culture you want to focus on that they have, right? And then, like Avi says, learning alongside them about their traditional culture could be really empowering for everybody. Yeah, that might be really cool. But draw those distinctions between your students' culture, because they definitely have culture, but it might not be traditional culture.
So we're out of time. I'm certain that the panelists would be open to